Okay, for this class, we're going to talk about power and how power operates within American society. Now, we commonly assume that the United States is a democracy, which means that power is basically concentrated within the people as a whole. As it says here, political power is vested in the people, and the government is based on the consent of the governed. Citizens participate in the decision-making process through elections and have the right to voice their opinions and influence policies. Democratic regimes aim to ensure the protection of individual rights and freedoms and promote the rule of law. So if you go back a little bit into ancient political philosophy, sort of the classic statement on this is Aristotle's different typologies of different regime types. So for him, there are basically three different ways in which political power can be organized. It can be held in the hands of one person, few people, or many people. And then corresponding with that, he thought that there were basically good and bad versions of each of these types of organizations of power. So when power is invested in the hands of one person, the good version of this is called a monarchy. The bad version, or the so-called perverted version of this, is a tyranny, where the tyrant basically rules, in their own interest instead of the interest of the community as a whole. That's kind of how Aristotle defines the difference between a good and bad regime type. A good regime rules in the interest of everybody. A bad regime rules in the interest of just the ruling group. So in the case of the tyrant, it's just the tyrant, according to Aristotle. Then you have political regimes or organizations of power where power is held in the hands of a few people. Again, the good version of that is what he calls an aristocracy. These are people who are supposedly wise and again, rule in the common interest. The bad version of that is what he called an oligarchy. And interestingly enough, Aristotle gave a very strong sort of economic definition to this as well. Oligarchs, basically, for Aristotle, were the wealthy elites who basically ruled in their own interest and basically, organized politics, organized society in a way that would protect their own wealth at the expense of everybody else. And then finally, when you get to political power being in the hands of many people, there is what he calls a polity. And then the bad version of that is actually what he calls a democracy. And this means basically the people that don't own any property, people who are not slaves, because of course slavery did exist in Aristotle's day in ancient Greece. People who were not slaves but did not own property and had the right to vote. He believed, without any restraints upon them, would be a bad form of government. Although he did consider it to be the least bad form of government, which is interesting. He considered it to be not as bad, basically, as an oligarchy or a tyranny, for example. Now, what he calls a polity kind of comes pretty close to what we would understand in the modern day sense, in fact, to be a democracy, which is that, again, going back to this definition here, the political power, the ability to make decisions, the ability to have authority over other people is vested within the people. It's, it's, again, as he says, it's in the hands of the many, not the few or the one. But there are restraints upon it, right? There are constitutional rules and there are, checks and balances and things like that, which basically restrain the the power of the popular majority to some extent. So Aristotle's version of what he called polity, or what is often, translated to be polity, is pretty close to what we would call modern day constitutional democracy, a republican form of government. People like to often, be cute and say like, well, technically we don't live in a democracy. We live in a republic. Well, that is true, but you could also counter back and say that, well, we live in a democratic republic. We live in a republican form of government where you have representative government, you have, again, constitutional rules, but it also tends to emphasize democratic control of things, or at least it's supposed to. This is the sort of the taken, for granted assumption that, of course, everyone has, right? Nobody really questions, well, many people don't question the sort of basic, democratic foundations of our government today, government of the people, for the people, and by the people, of course, as Abraham Lincoln famously said. One person who does question this, though, is Sheldon Wolin. And this is kind of why I picked this reading or picked his ideas as sort of the jumping off point. Because Wolin quite explicitly argues that what we take to be democracy within the United States is kind of a sham. It's kind of an illusion. And you could debate whether or not that was always the case or whether that has emerged at a certain later date. Now, what he gives a name to this, he refers to this as the theory of inverted totalitarianism. Quite a bit of a mouthful. But what the idea means, basically, the term implies, is that it is taking the idea of totalitarianism and basically turning it upside down. So what is so-called classical totalitarianism? Well, when we think of historical examples of this, again, as I mentioned briefly last class, we're talking about things like Nazi Germany. We're talking about, based upon your political views, I guess, the Soviet Union, China under Mao, various other communist regimes like that. Although, the big one, the one that pretty much everyone agrees on, I would say, is probably Nazi Germany. So what characterized Nazi Germany? I mean, according to Wolin and according to many other people. Well, this was a political regime. Of course, the people had no say at all. It was power was fully concentrated at the top. But the political sphere, the government, essentially, tended to dominate every other aspect of life, including the economic sphere, including the realm of corporations and business and labor relations between workers and employers. That was all more or less subordinated to the dictates of the Nazi Party, who controlled the government, obviously. And their control tended to be very total. Of course, that's hence the term totalitarianism. Wolin is essentially turning this formula of politics over economics upside down. And essentially what he is saying is that in the United States of today, or at least when he was writing, what we have is economics over politics. In other words, you have the subordination of the political sphere to the economic sphere. Now, maybe another alternative term for this, since he gives a very strong emphasis to the power of corporations and the power of elite economic actors, I guess you could also call this corporate totalitarianism, or maybe corporate financial totalitarianism, or corporate fascism, since fascism and totalitarianism are usually very closely aligned concepts. But it's basically a political regime type where power has become concentrated at the top in the hands of again, elite political and economic actors. Big corporations play a very big role in this, and of course the average citizen is more or less shut out of the political process. So this concept is Wolin's theoretical framework to understand how democratic institutions and practices can be undermined and political power can be concentrated through less visible, managed, and corporate-dominated means. The influence of corporate interest and the erosion of democratic values and practices are central themes in his analysis of this. So Wolin, again, is writing this. The earliest version of this basically takes shape in an article he wrote in 2003 during the Bush administration. And of course, that plays a very big role in his understanding of American politics. And that is also, by the way, the essay that I assigned. I thought it was short and fairly easy to read, and so would be more appropriate for students. What he talks about in this article, though, later became sort of expanded into a book, which was published in 2008, called, what was it? Managed Democracy, Inverted Totalitarianism, and the Specter of... No, it was called Democracy Incorporated, Managed Democracy, and the Specter of Inverted Totalitarianism, published in 2008. Now, I also included in the link on Blackboard an interview that he has with the journalist Chris Hedges. Shortly before he died, Wolin died in 2015. I think this was maybe just a year or so before he died, maybe even less. So he died before Trump was elected, obviously. It's a fairly long interview. It's composed of different parts. It's about 3 hours. It's made up of several different parts. If you have time during the class, maybe even after the class is over, bookmark this, save it. Maybe you'll get to it at a later date. later point. I think it's worth watching and listening to, even if you sort of break it up into little pieces at a time, because it basically allows Wolin to sort of go more in depth into things. Now, when he writes this article originally, he seems to trace the origins of inverted totalitarianism basically to the Bush administration and everything that was going on then in the aftermath of 9/11, even preceding that, the stealing of the election in 2000 against Al Gore. But in this interview that he does with Hedges, it seems to allow him to go a little more in depth into it. And he seems to sort of trace out the history of inverted totalitarianism much further back than that, back to the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan, back to the 1930s in the reaction against the New Deal of the 1930s. And although he may not argue it explicitly, I mean, you could really question to what extent this has always been the case. I mean, and what he's basically saying here is that, and I think what makes this a very sort of, profound theory of politics, something which will hopefully sort of guide us through the rest of the class as we sort of relate things that we talk about to this idea, to sort of see how well this idea or this theory stacks up, is that, besides the idea of, corporate control and things like that, it's the idea, like I already said, is that democracy, he's saying, is basically a sham. We have sort of the formal trappings of a democracy. We have political parties, we have elections, we have the illusion of choice, we have the illusion of popular control and participation and things like that. But Wolin would argue that basically all these things are pretty much hollow, that they're kind of empty, that they're a show, that they're an illusion, that they're a theatrical play, basically, to distract our attention from the fact that basically all the most important decisions and political actions that are taken pretty much happen, without any real significant input from the public at all. So if you look at some of the, the characteristics of this, I've already sort of mostly sketched out some of them, but he talks about the idea of corporate influence. The corporations wield significant influence over the political process and policy making, that they are able to exert their power through lobbying, campaign contributions, and the ability to shape public opinion through media ownership. That, of course, is true. I don't see how anyone could really argue against that. Of course, we have, one of the more controversial aspects of American politics that's happened over the last decade or so, a little more now, is the idea that pretty much there are no restrictions now on how much money corporations and very wealthy individuals can spend in election campaigns. That obviously, that clearly gives them an enormous advantage, especially where you look at the statistics over who wins elections, and pretty much most of the time, whatever candidate raises more money tends to win the election. That's not always true, of course, but it does tend to be true most of the time. Again, the second characteristic, managed democracy. I've already kind of gone through that. Again, we have the formal trappings of democracy, but it's basically just a show. Elections are sort of bought and sold by whoever has more money and who's able to manipulate the media better. I mean, why does money matter so much in elections? I mean, basically, most people at the end of the day still, believe what they see on TV and believe what they read in the newspapers and things like that. And who's ever able to spend more money to get their message out there more tends to win, a significant amount of time. Several years ago, in fact, the Washington Post, one of the more important newspapers within the United States, published a study showing that in federal elections, not necessarily state or local, but in federal elections, basically, congressional elections, the candidate that raised more money pretty much won like 90% of the time. So it's overwhelming in many cases, at least. Again, the concentration of power, political power, becomes increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few dominant economic and political actors, the so-called political elite, the corporate elites. The concentration of power limits the influence of ordinary citizens and favors the interests of a privileged elite. Loss of public control. The role of the public in shaping policy and the direction of the state is pretty much non-existent. Government actions prioritize corporate interests and economic growth over the welfare and preferences of the general population. Erosion of civil liberties. Now, this would be one of the things that does more directly relate to what was going on during the Bush administration with the Patriot Act and things like that. But, you know, all these things continue to this very day. And it was kind of heading that way even before Bush. But certainly, you know, since Bush, it hasn't gotten much better in this regard. If you look at what is defined here, the state uses surveillance, security measures, and the expansion of executive power to suppress dissent and maintain control. Obviously, we've all heard about the revelations made by people like Edward Snowden of the widespread surveillance that the government engages in, pretty much behind the backs of the people. We talk about the militarization of the police, the mass incarceration state, a very important aspect of this as well. The loss of privacy, people being arrested without even being put on trial and shipped off to Guantanamo Bay or the CIA black sites and things like that if they're a suspected terrorist or something like that or anything like that. Individual civil liberties such as privacy and free speech may be curtailed in the name of national security or stability. The illusion of participation. Again, it presents the appearance of public participation and engagement through staged events, controlled media narratives, and carefully managed political spectacles, like the impeachment of Donald Trump, for example, although there are many other examples that you could probably think of. However, genuine citizen participation in decision-making is limited. Then you have the influence of the media. Media plays a crucial role in shaping public opinion and controlling the narrative in inverted totalitarian systems. Media outlets may be consolidated and dominated by powerful interests, leading to biased reporting and limited diversity of perspectives. So again, another major issue that people talk about is the concentration of media within this country. It used to be widely reported that there were about 5 or 6 companies that control something like 90% of media within this country. That's, film studios, television networks, radio stations, publishing. Now, media has gotten, a lot bigger, obviously, over the last decade or so. And that might not be entirely true to today, that only literally a handful or so of corporations control that much of the media, given the, explosion of digital media and things like that. But according to more recent reports on this from organizations like Free Press, which follows these things, and organizations like that, it's not that much more. Maybe it's 10 or 20 corporations now, but media is still incredibly consolidated within this country. And keeping in mind that media has become much larger. It's now beyond television and movies and things like that. It's the internet, it's streaming services, it's all these other things. So the media is still incredibly and highly concentrated. And oftentimes, the media does, especially the news media within this country, does kind of function like propaganda. Again, going back to the Bush administration, it's impossible not to talk about these things and think about all the lies surrounding the invasion of Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction, attempts to link Saddam Hussein to 9/11, all these things were passed off as serious, credible narratives, basically, that were, uncritically parroted and echoed, not just by the Bush administration, but by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, by other influential magazines like the New Yorker, like the Atlantic, like television news networks, MSNBC, CNN. All of these people were pretty much complicit in it. And most of them are still around to this very day. There hasn't really been much of a change. Now these people are talking about whatever it is, Chinese aggression or, whatever else, the Wuhan lab leak theory and, all sorts of crazy stuff like that. So I would argue that, again, as a theory for understanding politics, I think it certainly describes very accurately where we are now. The question is, how far does this actually go back? Has the United States always been like this? Has democracy in this country always been kind of a sham? Well, you could make a pretty good argument about that when you consider about, the obvious, historical facts of people who have been excluded from participating within American politics. Obviously, when I talk about that, Black Americans, women, things which have maybe in some regards slightly improved, but are still very, significant issues to this very day, especially how Black Americans are treated within the United States. So here's a quote from Wolin where he kind of runs through the different institutions. And I think this is interesting because he kind of covers everything. So he says in this article, he says, thus the elements are in place. A weak legislative body, he's talking about Congress, that doesn't really oppose the president. Now, again, to contextualize this in 2003, when he's talking about this, the Bush administration is hell-bent on invading Iraq. Of course, we've already invaded Afghanistan by 2003. I don't know if anyone at the time could have foreseen that would turn into a 20-year fiasco that it did. But leading up to the invasion of Iraq, what was Congress doing? Was Congress exercising its check and balance over the abuse of power by the executive branch? No. Was even the opposing party within Congress, the Democrats, doing anything significantly to oppose Bush? No. All the leading Democrats of that time, including Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, basically voted to authorize Bush to go to war. They later lamely tried to explain that or excuse that away by saying, like, well, we gave him authorization, but we didn't think he would actually use it. Really? Well, why? I mean, what made you think that he wouldn't actually do it? It's a horrible excuse, and it's just their way basically trying to save their own ass. But anyway, so you have a weak legislative body, a legal system that is both compliant and repressive. I think that's an interesting point as well. So what he's saying is that, again, a legal system which doesn't, talking about the courts here, basically, which also does not sort of activate. The executive branch is doing something that it shouldn't be doing. It's overreaching its authority. It's abusing its authority. In theory, the checks and balances within our Constitution should sort of come into play. That means both, the Congress has the ability to check the executive branch to some extent by voting to, authorize things. The Supreme Court also has the ability to sort of, strike down things that the president is doing as unconstitutional. But what did the court do against the Bush administration? Not really anything. In fact, they pretty much approved of all the things that the Bush did. Not just going to war, but the massive increase in surveillance that took place once the Patriot Act was passed. The use of torture by the Bush administration was basically approved by courts within these countries. So that's what he means basically by the courts being compliant. However, it's repressive at the same time. But who is it repressive against? Not the Bush administration, but again, against Black Americans within the United States, against people who dissent against the United States, against anti-war protesters, against Black Lives Matter protesters, against people who are, convicted of drug possession crimes and things like that. Then you see a very tough and very harsh legal system, right, which imposes very strict and severe penalties upon people. That's basically what he means by both compliant and repressive at the same time. A party system in which one party, whether in opposition or in the majority, is bent upon reconstituting the existing system so as to permanently favor a ruling class of the wealthy, the well-connected, and the corporate, while leaving the poorer citizens with a sense of helplessness and political despair, and at the same time keeping the middle classes dangling between fear of unemployment and expectations of fantastic rewards once the new economy recovers. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, and we'll certainly talk about this more or throughout the class, but basically, he's talking about, or he starts off at least by talking about the political party system. So first of all, the United States has two political parties. Most countries have much more than that. Not to say that they're that much better, but two parties is not really a whole lot of choice. Technically, you do have other parties that exist, but as we all know, I think it's extremely difficult for either the, for any party besides the Republican and the Democratic Party to make any real dent or make any real impact within American politics. So you have two parties. Okay, that's not a lot. Do you at least have legitimate choices? Do you at least have meaningful choices between the two? Wolin would say not really. And again, I would find it hard to argue with him on that point either. Now, that's an important thing. A lot of people like to think, or, depending upon your view, of course, but a lot of people that I encounter, students and otherwise, tend to like to think that the Democratic Party represents the lesser of two evils, right? That's a phrase that I hear very often. What do you say about that? Lesser of two evils. First of all, it's a very sort of defensive way of looking at things. people who support Trump, for better or for worse, whatever else you might think about them, they don't look at Trump as the lesser of two evils. They actually like Trump. They think Trump is like a positive good. He's a force for good in the world, at least according to their point of view. Democratic voters have to vote for the lesser of two evils in every election. I've heard this term used pretty much throughout my entire adult life. I remember professors telling me about this when I was in college, about voting for John Kerry and things like that, or Al Gore even. It is pretty much something that you tell voters who are extremely demoralized, who really can't muster any real great enthusiasm about the candidate, but they feel like they have to vote for him anyway. It's a very, like I said, defensive way of looking at things. It's people who are, it represents a group of voters or even a political party that's pretty much on the retreat, is pretty much up against the ropes most of the time. And for a group of voters who are extremely demoralized, basically, about the candidates that they have to work for. Now, beyond that, so that's one reason to criticize the whole lesser of two evils thing. Yeah. Besides that, though, are the Democrats even the lesser of two evils? At least on every issue. I mean, can you actually make that claim? I would say on a lot of issues, they seem pretty much to be the same. I don't think you can even really make an argument. Certain issues, maybe, like abortion would obviously be one where you can at least see some discernible difference between the two. Not even a significant one, but some. But on other issues, I mean, when it comes to COVID, for example, I don't think there's that much of a difference in how either party has reacted to COVID. Obviously, I think they've done a horrible job of protecting people against this virus, which has killed, over 1 million people and probably severely impacted millions more. When it comes to things like the border, how much of was that a highly publicized issue during the Trump administration? People talking about abolish ICE and all this other stuff, AOC out there saying stuff like that. Well, ICE is still around. Where are these people now? Where's AOC now saying things like that? Pretty much, I mean, most of the same policies that were in place under the Trump administration continue now under the Biden administration. Of course, prior even to Trump, the Obama-Biden administration set records, literally, for the number of deportations that took place under their administration. So I would argue there's not a significant difference between the two of them. I would argue on things like foreign policy. Well, what's going on now with China and with Russia and the invasion of Ukraine. I never thought I would live to see this day, as somebody who did live through the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But if anything, it seems like that the Democrats are even more aggressive, or as they would say, more hawkish when it comes to foreign policy than even the Republican Party is. I mean, it's a Democratic administration now, which is escalating things with Russia, constantly giving the Ukraine more and more weapons. The most recent thing is giving the Ukrainian government these cluster bombs, which are basically considered a prohibited weapon. You're essentially engaging in a war crime by using these things. There was a treaty that was signed about that back in 2008. The United States did not sign that treaty to ban the use of cluster bombs or cluster munitions, as they call it. But it is a highly prohibited thing, and it's something that if you use prohibited weapons in war or make them available to people, that could technically be considered a war crime. So keep that in mind. And on various other issues as well, I would argue that there's not a significant difference between the Democratic and Republican Party, at least on some issues. I mean, you would have to take it on a case-by-case basis, but I don't even know that you can necessarily argue that the Democratic Party is the lesser of two evils on every single issue. And as Wolin points out, both parties, no matter which one is in power, basically favors the interest of the corporate elites, the so-called 1% that we have in this country, which I think is true as well. At the same time, while basically economic standards of living for many people have gone down significantly, certainly over the last decade or so, but probably over the last several decades, probably since the 1980s, you can see sort of a noticeable decline in living standards. Wages have been stagnant. cost of living goes up and up and up. It's getting harder and harder for people to get by, basically. He says that scheme is abetted by a sycophantic and increasingly concentrated media. A sycophant is basically a nice way of saying, or a more, educated way of saying, calling somebody basically an ass kisser. That's essentially what he's saying, a brown noser, a suck up. But the media, again, rather than holding the government accountable, rather than, publishing information that would lead people to criticize things that the government does, or again, basically hold the government accountable for its actions, basically, functions more or less as propaganda. And again, it's impossible to talk about these things in this context without talking about the Iraq War, but there are various other things that you can talk about as well. Up until the very day, up until the media being a cheerleader for this war going on in Ukraine, which is not to say to condone what Putin did, which is horrible, but then you hear about things about neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian military, and you hear you see this constant escalation of the U.S. giving more and more weapons to the Ukraine. You have to start to wonder at some point, is this going to escalate to a nuclear war? And as far as China goes and things like that, the media is very much complicit in that as well, as sort of building up China to be the next big threat that the United States is going to have to go after. By the integration of universities with their corporate benefactors, more and more universities are developing very cozy relationships with corporations, sort of doing the bidding of corporations. This has kind of been a longstanding thing. During the Vietnam War, there were significant protests over things about that. If anything, universities themselves are kind of becoming like corporations. I mean, they sort of function like corporations, and that they want to make a profit. They want their revenues that they get from tuition dollars and parking permits and all this other great stuff to exceed what they spend over a given period of time. If your research as a professor is not generating money, not generating revenue for the university, then your research is not going to get supported, or your employment possibly with the university is not going to get supported either. By a propaganda machine institutionalized in well-funded think tanks and conservative foundations. Again, that's another thing, these sort of private research organizations that exist outside of the academic world, but kind of perform a similar role in that they publish papers, they try to influence political policy through research and things like that. Many of them, of course, are heavily subsidized and funded by very conservative groups. By the increasingly closer cooperation between local police and national law enforcement agencies aimed at identifying terrorists, suspicious aliens, and domestic dissidents. So again, you have this, militarization of police. You have this closer cooperation between federal and local law enforcement authorities, sharing information, profiling people, again, Muslims after 9/11, and still to this very day, obviously racial profiling over Black Americans as well, and other people of color. So, this article was written 20 years ago, 2003. Has a lot changed really since then? I don't see it. If anything, I would say things have probably gotten worse. To me, like I said, the only real question is, how far does this actually go back? Does this run throughout all of American history, or does it only run through a part of American history? And at this point, I'm kind of leaning to the side of all of American history, to be honest with you. So some of the effects that we have of this: very low voter turnout. Barely, half of the registered voters show up to vote in most elections. Now, the recent presidential election was a pretty high turnout, about 66%, I think, or something like that. Still not, extraordinarily high compared to many other countries, compared to even the United States in previous, historical periods of time. The most recent, 2022 midterm election, you had about a 52% voter turnout, according to the Census Bureau, and they kind of tried to portray it as that was like a great thing, like that was like a high turnout compared to what they usually see. Barely, like I said, just barely over 50% of people vote in an important election. It's not really saying much, but to what extent is low voter turnout the fault of the public, their apathy, their laziness, their ignorance, as some people like to make it out to be, or to what extent are people just tuning out from politics because they see that it's kind of like a meaningless thing? That and the fact that, you know, it's very hard for people to vote. We don't make it exactly easy for people to vote in this country either. Interestingly, as it turns out, voter turnout in the country was still pretty high through the 1960s. It started to significantly decline, basically, I think, after the 1968 election. I think about what was going on within the 1960s. You had political assassinations. You had, you know, presidents resigning, as in Richard Nixon in the early 1970s, but who was, you know, elected in 1968. To what extent does the fact that people sort of tuned out of politics after that reflect things like that? I mean, it's something to keep in mind. Of course, the United States, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about rice later on in the class, but the United States is pretty much the only country in the world, the only major, you know, industrialized economy, developed economy within the world that does not guarantee universal access to healthcare, to education, to housing, to have affordable public housing for people. That I would say is also a consequence of this, because, you know, if the public actually did have input, if the public actually did have some say or input into what was going on politically within this country, then I think you would probably have those things. I mean, those things in public opinion polls are usually polled pretty highly. I mean, most people seem to support the idea of universal health care and things like that, yet we don't have those things. So I think that would be a reflection of the fact that, you know, average people don't really have much say within the political process. You have, extremely high levels of inequality within the country. Poverty is another thing that is interesting, and that it depends a lot on how you track it and how you measure it. Nobody can argue that the gap, the income gap in terms of wealth and income inequality has simply exploded since the 1980s. And I'll have a chart to show that later on in the class. But how do you measure poverty? Well, by some accounts, you know, it would seem like not many people live within poverty within this country. Again, according to the Census Bureau, only 11% of the population. I say only 11%. That's still like 38 million people, by the way. But according to the Census Bureau, 11% of the population lives below the federal poverty line of $15,225 for an individual under 65. A person over 65, it's a little bit less. It's like 14,000. For a family of three, that's $22,892. So if you're a family, you know, living in a household of a family of three within the United States, if you were making if your household income is $23,000, then in the eyes of the federal government, you're not poor. I mean, that is just an absurd standard. Anyone with half a brain in their head realizes that that is not a realistic standard for poverty. Yes, there are people like that, and they're extremely poor, but there are many people who would be not poor, not living at the poverty line in the eyes of the government, who would, in a more realistic standard, be considered poor. I mean, you could be well above that threshold and still have significant problems getting by. According to the sociologist Matthew Desmond, 1 in 3 people survive on less than $55,000 a year. Basically, 30% of Americans survive on less than $55,000 a year. Not a significant amount. That's, you know, barely just enough to get by, I would say. You know, and obviously that's going to depend a lot on where you live and things like that. But that's a significant amount of people. I would say probably, you know, if you look at it in a more realistic way, probably almost like half of people in this country are basically poor, or, you know, severely, you know, struggling to get by. Now, that's in a general sense. When you look at it, when you break it down sort of by race and ethnicity, these differences are even more magnified, right? So what they call the median household income for white households within this country is about $188,200. Now, that's a median, so that means that there's, you know, people above that and people below that. The median income for Black households within this country is $24,100. And I have a chart here. This is from the Federal Reserve Board in St. Louis. Let me move this around a little bit so you can see this better. Or maybe, I think when I move my camera, it doesn't move when I'm recording. But anyway, I do post this PowerPoint, so you'll be able to see it better if you can't see it now. So this breaks it down, again, in terms of white, Black, and Hispanic, and also breaks it down by educational level. And you can see there's a significant disparity here between white households and between Black and Hispanic households within the country. Now, obviously, there's also a relationship between education level as well. But there are, again, significant disparities among race and ethnicity within this country as well, which of course has been an issue throughout the entire history of the country. I mean, this would certainly be one argument to argue that what Wolin is talking about basically runs throughout all of American history. Now, the other thing I mentioned is that, one interesting thing to look at also is corporate surveillance. Again, in an inverted totalitarian state, there's almost this kind of, fusion of power, or this sort of blurring of the lines between governments and corporations. And corporations themselves are sort of allowed to act with much more impunity, and they're allowed to get away with a lot more things. And one of, I think, the most disturbing aspects that you see going on now is the extent to which corporations are now basically, so we talk about the government keeping people under surveillance, reading your emails and listening to your phone calls, and all this other stuff that the NSA does, revealed by people like Snowden. But corporations are also basically keeping their employees under almost constant surveillance, not because they're afraid of their political views or what they might be saying, or because they might possibly be a terrorist or something like that, but because they want to make sure that they can squeeze as much profit out of their employees as they possibly can. And the way you do that, of course, is by making your employees work very, very hard. So this is from a report from the New York Times. They report that in lower paying jobs, monitoring by corporations, by employers, is already ubiquitous. Not just at Amazon, where the second-by-second measurements became notorious. So they're assuming that that's probably fairly well known, and it probably is, but for anyone that's not aware of that, Amazon is constantly monitoring the productivity of their employees. And you've heard all sorts of stories about, people not being allowed to take bathroom breaks, people wearing diapers when they're at work because they're afraid of, leaving their post for even a couple of minutes. People, developing, severe back problems and physical ailments from the constant, grueling work schedule that they have to work, that they have to maintain. And this is how Amazon makes money, basically. And they don't pay their employees very much either. I mean, Amazon, for a while, I don't know if it's still true now, but had a significant part of its workforce had to collect food stamps and things like that and go on welfare because they were being paid so little. Of course, Jeff Bezos, one of the richest people in the world, I think at one point the richest person in the world, has billions and billions of dollars, yet he paid his employees so low that many of them had to go on welfare. That's obviously an inexcusable thing. But beyond that, beyond the low pay, you have this constant surveillance, this constant monitoring of everything that you are doing. Now, this obviously goes beyond just Amazon. They also talk about Kroger cashiers, one of the large supermarket chains, UPS drivers who are, currently involved in a major contract negotiation, and there's a very good chance might go on strike at the end of the month, and millions of others. 8 of the 10 largest private U.S. employers track the productivity metrics of individual workers, many in real time, according to an examination by the New York Times. Many employees, they go on to report, whether working remotely or in person, are subject to trackers, score. So this is so they talk about this for, so-called blue collar or so-called unskilled labor. But they're also saying this is also becoming much more of a thing in so-called white-collar jobs, people that work in offices and things like that. So now people working in offices have to deal with, their activity being tracked, scores, idle buttons. Your employer keeps track of how much time you're spending on your computer and things like that, how many mouse clicks that you're making and things like that. As it says, pauses can lead to penalties from lost pay to lost jobs. One of the more disturbing aspects of this is they report a chaplain whose job was to, basically care for dying patients in a hospital. This chaplain had to accrue productivity points. And the way in which these points were assigned were things like a visit to a dying person, as little as 1 point. You only get 1 point for visiting a dying person. Participating in a funeral, 1 3/4 points. A phone call to grieving relatives, 1/4 point. This is the insane, inhuman, cruel ways in which employers are coming up with ways to like I said, basically squeeze more profit out of their employees. I mean, we'll talk more about Marxist theory and how capitalism works, but that is sort of one basic element of it, right? I mean, the more you can raise the productivity of your workforce, get them producing more stuff, more output per hour, more profit you make, basically. So that's one important part of it. Now, interestingly enough, how do we compare the United States, this supposed bastion, this supposed haven of democracy in the world, to other countries? Well, Wolin talks a lot about classical totalitarianism, especially in that interview, if you watch, with Hedges. Hedges, by the way, is an interesting person in his own right, in that he was a former journalist for the New York Times, a guy who went into war zones, won awards for it and things like that, who was basically pushed out by the Times for speaking out against the Iraq War. One of the few journalists in the United States actually spoke out against the Iraq War. Now, I say pushed out because technically he wasn't fired. By his own account, he basically quit before he could get fired. But it was clear, again, by his account of things, that the Times was preparing to do so. They were getting ready. There were rules to it. You couldn't just fire him outright. You had to sort of go through certain procedures to fire somebody, and they had sort of initiated that process. So he basically quit before they could fire him for speaking out against the Iraq War. Nobody who repeated the lies of the Bush administration got fired. If anything, they got promotions from it. So Hedges himself is an interesting person as well. And a lot, like I say, if you have time, maybe even not during the course of the semester, but at some point, I would very much urge people to listen to that interview between Wolin and Hedges, as is very interesting. But anyway, so you talk about classical versions of totalitarianism. What about a contemporary example? What about China? Now, is China still a totalitarian regime? Most people would argue it was when Mao Zedong was the chairman and basically leader of communist China. I guess it's a debatable point if it still is today, or if it's just a more run-of-the-mill average, dictatorship or authoritarian government. In political science terms, you usually make a distinction between totalitarian and authoritarian governments, although the lines between the two can become blurred. But suffice to say, I mean, most people would consider China to not be a democratic regime, a democratic government. So how does China compare to the United States? You would think that would make a very sharp contrast. But I'm not so sure that is the case. So, what do people usually single out about China when they talk about China? Human rights violations that go on within China, its treatment of ethnic minorities within China, whether it's people in Tibet, the Uyghurs who live in Western China, its treatment over people in Hong Kong, its treatment over people within mainland China who, dissent against the government and things like that. I don't want to discount any of those things or suggest any of those things are not true or that they're being made up. I'm not there either, but I would assume that they probably are. It seems like there's too many people that talk about these things for it all to be made up. But is the U.S. that much better? I mean, how many dictatorships does the U.S. support throughout the world, past and present? Look at all the dictatorships the United States supported in Latin America. Almost every government in Latin America, at one point, had some kind of U.S. sponsored dictatorship, including Cuba, before Castro took over. And of course, that goes on throughout other parts of the world as well, Southeast Asia and elsewhere. How many people have died in U.S. wars? Millions and millions of people. There's something known as the Cost of War Project, sponsored by Brown University. They recently released a new report on the number of people who have died in U.S. wars since 2001. They put the number at 4.5 million people that they attribute responsibility to the United States for since 2001. I mean that is an indescribable amount. I mean, that's almost like Adolf Hitler numbers. I mean, let's that's almost as many Jews died in the Holocaust. 6 million is the figure commonly cited, although the overall deaths in World War II was much greater than that. I mean, that's an unthinkable amount. So how does the U.S. have any real ground to act like we're the gold standard when it comes to human rights? And then, of course, domestically, long history of oppression against Black Americans within the United States and other populations as well. Look at the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Censorship within China. Yes, again, I'm not going to argue. I'm going to assume all these things about China are true. My point being, though, of course, is that we act like these are things that you can single out about China. I would argue every one of these things. You can find pretty strong examples of this going on within the United States as well. I mean, again, the media in this country maybe is not overtly censored, but it basically functions like propaganda. And alternative media and media that isn't owned by a major corporation or something like that oftentimes do find themselves being censored. And not just people on the right either. Many left-wing sites, people are very, again, critical of capitalism, critical of American foreign policy and things like that, find themselves, or at least claim to have been censored as well. We talk about government spying. The Chinese government is keeping everyone under surveillance. Well, again, we all know that the United States does that as well. We talk about Chinese aggression on the world stage. Well, okay, is China fighting any wars right now? I mean, people who talk this way, the so-called foreign policy establishment within the United States, as well as foreign policy journalists, act like China has been at war for the last 20 years, killing millions of people. They haven't. The United States has, and yet nothing seems to get through these people. Nothing can sort of shake their faith. These foreign policy elites shake their faith in the sort of essential goodness of the United States, that we are good no matter what, no matter how many millions of people get killed, no matter how many governments we overthrow, and no matter how many dictatorships that we support, we're still the good guys no matter what. And of course, torture. Again, lots of allegations of the Chinese government torturing people who oppose the government in some way. Again, I'm not going to argue with any of that, but the United States doesn't torture people, or at least wasn't during the Bush administration, and probably at many other points as well. So, I don't see how you can look at a country like that, or really any country, Cuba, whatever country that's out there, and act like that we're really that much better than them. I just don't think so. We talk about the various, failures of the media. Listen, not all these things I'm going to have that much time to go in depth on, but so I'll just kind of mention them briefly. Downplaying the theft of the election in 2000. Okay, a big influence on Wolin's views of the government at the time in which he was writing. Bush stole the election. I don't have time to explain exactly how that happened, but look it up, and almost anyone around in that period of time would have thought the same way. Apparently, except for Al Gore, I guess. But they did. And so Bush is an unelected president who takes office anyway, goes on to become possibly the worst president in American history, certainly among the list of worst American presidents. Of course, I've already pointed out, the lies over weapons of mass destruction and the invasion of Iraq. Russiagate, a more recent one. This idea of Russian hacking of the elections in 2016 and collusion between the Russian government and the Trump administration. Well, there's no real evidence to support these things. A lot of the allegations that were made against Trump and Russia were contained in what was known as the Steele dossier, which turned out it was basically the Clinton administration had paid for this thing, had paid for this project by this guy, Christopher Steele, who was a former British intelligence agent. Again, don't have time to go through the whole morass of details about it, but suffice to say, it is now commonly acknowledged that many of the things that were contained in there are based on very dubious evidence, to say the very least. The company that was hired to investigate after the DNC's emails were hacked in 2016 was this company called CrowdStrike, who also had very close ties to the Democratic Party. It was recently revealed that in testimony, the CEO of the company admitted that they had no real concrete evidence that Russia had actually hacked the DNC servers. That was testimony given in 2017, but it was kept secret basically until 2020. Now, that is important because not only does it obviously cast doubt on what they're saying, but the FBI, who supposedly did their own independent investigation and came up with the same conclusion that it was Russian hacking, relied on the information that CrowdStrike had. The FBI was not allowed to actually examine the DNC servers. So they basically accepted the information provided to them by this company called CrowdStrike. So their independent investigation, in other words, was not that independent. Now, I'm not saying that Russia did not hack the DNC in 2016. The point, though, is that the evidence that this rests upon is very shaky. Maybe it's still true. You know, it doesn't necessarily, like I said, disprove it either. But was any of that uncertainty communicated to the American public? No, it was taken as an established fact that Russia hacked the DNC, and Russia hacked the election in 2016. And that message was drilled into people's heads again and again and again for years, for like 4 years. I mean, it was basically up until the COVID hit, as far as I can tell, when that story kind of quietly went away. Although, again, it's still taken as an established fact. Now, the other thing about this is that what was in those emails that were supposedly hacked, that I've always felt was the real story, right? Not that somebody got these emails or somebody got into the DNC's emails, which I've also heard that the guy who got hacked, this guy, John Podesta, basically fell for a very run-of-the-mill phishing scam, which is, you know, everybody gets these things. You know, you get an email from someone saying, oh, your password's about to expire, you know, click here now. He apparently fell for that. I mean, I can't help but laugh because it's like, I get these emails, you know, several times a week, it seems like, and you can pretty much see through it most of the time. But anyway, what was in those emails were things like Hillary Clinton's speaking fees from banks like Goldman Sachs, giving her hundreds of thousands of dollars to speak, which is obviously just a way of, you know, bribing her, basically. It cast serious doubts on the 2016 Democratic primary. It revealed how much that the DNC was in it for Hillary Clinton. Not that really should have been that much of a surprise, but the extent to which they were helping Hillary win was there. It also showed in a very embarrassing way that Hillary Clinton wanted to run against Trump. Hillary Clinton was instructing their allies in the media to give Trump as much attention as you possibly could, because they thought that Trump would be the easier candidate to beat. Well, we all know how that turned out. So I always felt that the real story was what was in those emails, not just the fact that the emails were stolen. And you got to give the Democratic Party credit. I mean, they very cleverly sort of shifted that whole narrative to instead of focusing on what was in those emails, to just the fact that the emails were stolen. But again, a lot of the evidence that this rests upon, it seems to be very shaky. Related to this is, of course, you know, smearing Julian Assange, WikiLeaks. He was the one who, you know, ended up with these emails. Now, he's always consistently denied that he got it from a Russian source. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he did and didn't know it. Maybe he's lying. Who knows? He has a much better track record for telling the truth, it seems, than most people within the media, though. And of course, he's revealed a lot of other important government secrets. Journalists in this country don't really stand up for him. He's currently on trial now, right? And possibly could be facing extradition to the United States. Barely even gets talked about, you know, at least within the mainstream media. Smearing of Bernie Sanders, the so-called Bernie bros, you know, falsely trying to present Bernie Sanders and Bernie Sanders supporters as if they're on the same level as Trump and Trump supporters, which, whatever your feelings are about Bernie Sanders, I think most people would realize that's obviously not true. Most of the stuff, the so-called Bernie bros things, you know, relies upon, you know, like basically people being mean on the internet. Apparently people in the Hillary Clinton campaign did not realize that people on the internet are incredibly shitty people who say really shitty, mean things to other people and hide behind the anonymity that they get from it. Most of the so-called hateful comments that they, you know, claim could be traced to Bernie Sanders supporters come from things like that. But you know what, Bernie Sanders supporters weren't like driving cars into people during demonstrations. They weren't, you know, shooting protesters and like Kyle Rittenhouse and people like that. So I think to draw an equivalence between the two is obviously very unfair. Gushing over Andrew Cuomo. Remember when COVID started, contrasting him to Trump and acting like he was this great leader. We all know how that turned out. The Caliphate podcast, probably something that's not very well known to people, but this was a podcast sponsored by the New York Times, claiming to have found somebody who claimed to have been in ISIS and did all these horrible things, beheading people and things like that. Won a bunch of awards, best podcast award and things like that. Turned out to be a complete fake. Guy completely made all the shit up. And as bad as that is, it makes the New York Times look bad too, that they didn't, properly investigate this guy. New York Times, mainstream media in this country is incredibly pro-Israel, completely minimizes Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people, either doesn't talk about it or even tries to defend it. And kind of the same thing with Saudi Arabia too, although in the case of Saudi Arabia, pretty much just not talking about it. I mean, as we speak, I mean, Saudi Arabia is still launching a horrible war. All we hear about is the Ukraine in this country for almost a decade now. Saudi Arabia has been bombing the shit out of the country of Yemen, killing something like, I think, 500,000 people, something which the United Nations has called the worst humanitarian crisis in the world today. You never hear anything about it. How is that any different than what Putin is doing in the Ukraine? If anything, the Saudi war against Yemen is even worse. It's I mean, in terms of death toll and the indiscriminate targeting of civilians and things like that, you never hear about it. As many people have said, if the media spent half as much time educating people about the concentration of wealth as it did over the antics of Donald Trump, then you would probably have a fairly educated, class conscious electorate. People would actually be pretty well informed about these things if they spent half as much time as what porn star Donald Trump has paid off, or something like that, or what files he kept from the White House. But you don't, and as a result, people are pretty not very knowledgeable about these things. Now, again, one of the effects that we see of this sort of greater I don't want to say that this is purely an effect of greater corporate control. It's more like there's kind of an interaction. It's kind of like a dynamic relationship between these two things. Corporations have always had a lot of power in the country, but as their power has grown, more and more wealth sort of flows to the top. That's what this chart basically shows you here. The concentration of income from 1917, when the income tax was first introduced, to 2012. And basically, the higher the line gets, the more concentrated income is among the top 10% of income earners, meaning that the level of inequality within society is greater. Now, this looks at wealth, pre-tax income. So after taxes, there would be more of an adjustment of it. But when you look at income disparity, that's one thing. When you look at wealth disparity in the United States, there's an even greater skew. Wealth encompasses more things than just income. Income is basically how much you get paid, what your salary is. Wealth, though, is like ownership over stocks and bonds and things that have value, property and things like that. So when you look at the wealth disparity within this country, it's even greater. And that's pretty bad because, as you can see, even based on income inequality, it's pretty high. I mean, the United States has never been as unequal as it is now. And as you can see, this is drastically accelerated since the 1980s. There was a period of time, where the country had become somewhat more equal. And I don't want to overstate that. Democrats love this chart, by the way. This is very well-known things by the economists Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Sayez, two French economists. Democrats love this thing, though, because they use it as an advertisement for the Democratic Party, because mid-20th century is basically when the Democratic Party reigned supreme. And they're basically saying, look, see how good it was when we were in charge. There is some truth to that, but things are still pretty bad, quite frankly, even in the middle of the 20th century. It's just gotten that much worse. It was never that great to begin with. And of course, it leaves open the question, well, if the Democrats were doing such a great job, then why did they lose power? Basically from the 1980s on. What happened there? There's a lot to be said. Some of it I'll return to. Listen to the Wolin interview. He'll go on about that more. But basically, the kind of New Deal policies that were put in place after the 1930s kind of stopped working. And like I said, maybe they were never really working as great as people would like you to believe. Wages have basically stayed relatively stagnant within this country. You see productivity has gone up. There was a time basically from 1948 to 1973 where hourly compensation or wages were going up almost at the same level as which economic productivity is going up. Since the 1970s, though, they have increasingly diverged from each other. Now, wages have not been totally stagnant, as some people claim, but relatively stagnant, and they have not kept pace at all with the cost of living. I mean, the cost of housing within this country has gone up 1,000% since the 1970s. You used to be able to buy a house for $30,000 in this area, too. I'm talking about, in the tri-state area. You can't do that anymore. I mean, you would be lucky if you find a house for $500,000 today. It's insane. Obviously, a person who was making $30,000 back then is making $300,000 now. So clearly, wages have not kept up with the massive increase in the cost of living. The United States has transitioned from a manufacturing-based economy to a financialized economy, which of course leads to financial speculation, more and more money being put into things like, well, not just stocks, but real estate, as it says here, the so-called FIRE economy, finance, insurance, and real estate. This has become sort of the dominant part of the economy. It doesn't produce a lot of things. The profits that it generates are mostly based on speculation. And as we've seen, it tends to create a lot of instabilities within the economy as well. This will be something else we'll probably return to. See a massive increase in debt as well. Well, again, that makes sense. If the cost of living is going up and people's wages are not going up, and people are taking on more and more debt. Now, beyond that, these economic factors or these economic indicators and metrics, one of the most disturbing trends that you see within the United States is the massive decline in life expectancy. People are not living as long. Or, to put it another way, more and more people are dying at very young ages, dying for all sorts of reasons: accidents, murder, overdoses, things like that. You used to hear these things that the life expectancy, and centuries ago was like 32 years or whatever it was, and that is not what you might think it is. It didn't mean that everybody died in their 30s. People lived to old ages back then too. What it meant is that you had a lot of people, kids, in fact, that would die at a very young age. And when you make that average, those people dying at very young ages tends to bring down the average as a whole. And that's kind of what you have here now. It's not that everybody is I mean, some people are living to incredibly long ages within the country. People are living into their 90s. Some people living into their 100s. There's a lady that lives on my floor who's like over 100 years old. But you have a lot of people who are dying very young for treatable diseases, diabetes, asthma, people who are, again, dying because of substance abuse issues, people who are dying, violently, and that is having a tremendous impact on this country. And a lot of these things, of course, are correlated with poverty. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, if you're poor, if you have a lower income in this country, you're much more likely to die of substance abuse, to be obese, to have any number of poor health consequences associated with that, to even die from COVID. Studies have shown that as well. People with lower incomes, poorer people die in much higher numbers from COVID than from middle or higher income people. And of course, as I've said, you see a massive increase in drug overdose deaths within this country. You see incarcerated Americans. Now, another aspect of this, the mass incarceration state within the United States. Another aspect, again, so when we're talking about the growing sort of, authoritarianism of the United States, that the United States is becoming a more, increasingly harsh country upon people. Some people are doing very well at the very top. Everyone else is not doing well. What is the solution to that? You have a lot of people who are facing all sorts of problems from lack of income and things like that. What is the solution? Basically, lock these people up. And of course, we know there's a massive racial disparity there as well. So according to the Prison Policy Initiative, the U.S. incarcerates almost 2 million people in 1,566 state prisons. There's only 50 states in the country. 98 federal prisons, 3,116 local jails, 1,323 juvenile correction facilities, 181 immigration detention facilities, and 80 Indian country jails, as well as military prisons, civil commitment centers, state psychiatric hospitals, and prisons in the U.S. Territories. It's a lot of people. Black Americans make up almost 40% of incarcerated people, despite only being 12% of the population. Now, not only does the U.S. have the highest incarceration rate in the world, every single U.S. state incarcerates more people per capita than virtually any independent democratic country on earth. So states like New York State, California, Texas, of course, incarcerates more people per capita. In other words, if you sort of break it down by population, incarcerates a greater portion of their population than pretty much any other democratic country on earth, and even non-democratic countries. So as it shows here, the per capita incarceration rate in the U.S. is 664 per 100,000 people. So basically, for every 100,000, this is a statistical measure. This is how you try to account for countries where you have greater differences in population levels. This is kind of meant to sort of even things out a little bit. 664 per 100,000 people in the U.S. So that means for every 100,000 people, you basically have almost 664 of them in prison. There's over 300 million people within the United States. In China, it's 121 per 100,000 people. So China actually incarcerates far less people per capita than does the United States, a country which we all know is an authoritarian country, is an undemocratic country, but actually incarcerates much less, a much less portion of its population than does the United States. Here's some various websites here. Now, finally, I've spent most of this time talking about Wolin. I'm not going to say much about my article, but just a couple of things to sort of outline it and how I think it sort of fits into this. Now, again, like Wolin, I share the idea that obviously that we are living in an inverted totalitarian state. The democracy is kind of an illusion. And to that extent, I think you see, the forces within society that want to have greater democracy within this country, the government tends to come down harshest upon them. While people who are undemocratic, who want actually the United States to become more of an authoritarian country, to punish people harder, to make things economically harder upon people, to provide less support to people and things like that, the government tends to deal with them much less harshly. And I think that is a double standard that you see basically running throughout American history. So in the article I wrote, I start off by talking about the contrast between how the government reacted to the January 6th Capitol riot, which for the most part, until things got really out of hand, wasn't really doing much about it at all, right? I mean, allow these people to pretty much come into the Capitol. There are still a lot of unanswered questions about why was there such a limited police presence there, even though people had forewarning that these people were going to be there. Why did the National Guard take whatever it was, 3 hours to get involved in this? Why were there so many FBI informants in the crowd that day? Why were there so many of these Proud Boys and all these, fascist groups that were seemed to be in close coordination with the Trump administration? Now, there have been committee, Congress has tried to investigate this thing, but there's still a lot of things that have not really been answered in a satisfactory way. But suffice to say, it seems like that, at least until they actually breached we're actually inside of the Capitol. And apparently, if you believe the accounts, mere seconds away from breaking into the chambers where Congress was actually assembled. Up until that point, they had pretty much gotten their way. On the other hand, the mostly nonviolent Black Lives Matter protests, which took place obviously over the summer of 2020, you saw a significant repression on the part of the state. Now, the media likes to frame those protests as if they were violent. According to Erica Chenoweth, who studies protests within the United States, that's her specialty, basically. She studied thousands of these events and concluded that 95% of them were basically nonviolent. Well, so that means basically 5% were violent. She studied about 7,000 events. 5% of that would be around 350 events. So it wouldn't be that hard for the media to sort of, cherry pick, or, we didn't see 350 incidents or violent protests. We saw a handful. So that's essentially what the media did. But by and large, if her research is to be believed, the vast majority of these protests were nonviolent. There were numerous incidences of police violence, though. She also argues that most of the time when violence did break out, it was usually at the instigation of the police. And there are difficulties comparing the two. We're talking about a series of protests, thousands of protests versus a singular event. So there's that aspect of it. One thing that you could, if you want to boil it down to one single event, how about when the police very violently, aggressively dispersed the protesters in Lafayette Square, which is in Washington, D.C., same city in which the Capitol riot happened. In fact, you had some of the same police units involved. But if you look at video footage of it, extreme violent reaction to these peaceful protesters. The Lafayette Square protest, by all accounts, was a peaceful protest, but was dispersed with great force on the part of the police. So that's kind of the question I'm trying to get at here. What accounts for this double standard? Now, the obvious answer that most people would have is because of race. Because the Capitol riot protesters were mostly white, and the Black Lives Matter protesters were, I don't know if they were even mostly black, though. I mean, it was a pretty multiracial, multi-ethnic affair. Certainly, there were a lot of black people within those protests, but as far as I could tell, the police didn't make any real distinction. They would beat black and white people alike. Now, the movement itself was literally called the Black Lives Matter protest. So obviously, that is an aspect to it as well. What they're protesting over has a strong racial dimension to it. Obviously, race matters a lot in it. But I would also argue that there's a very strong class element to it as well. Particularly, again, over not so much that they're just beating up poor people, although people, studies have also shown that most of the Capitol riot protesters were also middle-class people. You didn't see a lot of poor white people there. It was mostly white. It was mostly middle-class white people, too. There weren't a lot of poor white people there, at least according to accounts for that. And I'm not saying most of the Black Lives Matter protesters were poor. They were probably working class people. I don't know if there were a lot of wealthy people or even middle class people there. Maybe some middle class people. I doubt there were very many very wealthy people out there, but maybe there may have been some as well. But class to a certain extent, but really what I mean by that is, again, people's relationship to capitalism within this country, and even people's relationship to democracy within this country. The Black Lives Matter protesters are trying to make the country a more democratic country. They're trying to make the country more democratic for black people within this country. The Capitol riot protesters are not doing anything to advance democracy within this country. If anything, they were trying to create a kind of presidential dictatorship under Donald Trump. I realize a lot of people now try to dismiss it as if it was not a big thing. I think it was. I think it was clearly an attempt at basically overthrowing the government. It didn't succeed, and maybe the people involved in it were idiots. Okay, fine, but I don't think. I don't think that doesn't mean that they weren't trying to do it. Whether or not they were going to succeed or not is different. But I think that's what they were trying to do. And some people would argue that they did get kind of close. If you read about how close they were to actually, getting their hands on members of Congress, and what kind of, support they may have had from people high up in various, police and military institutions within the United States. So I think there's the relationship to democracy. One group wants to enhance democracy within this country. One is antagonistic to democracy, yet the government comes out more harshly against the people who are more pro democracy than the other group. And I think the other thing is the relationship to capitalism. Now, Black Lives Matter is not a socialist movement. It's not necessarily an anti-capitalist movement, but I would argue that people within the Black Lives Matter protests are probably more receptive, more open to an anti-capitalist message than people on the right. Many of these people in these, Proud Boys groups and these other militia groups, they call themselves, radical free market, super pro capitalist. I mean, that is a part of their ideology, and that is a part of their identity as much as anything else. So those two things, I think, also play a very significant role, besides the, I would say fairly obvious racial aspects to it. But how the government responds to people who have a more radical view of democracy and people who are maybe more potentially critical of capitalism. I'm not even sure how potential it is. I would probably assume that a lot of Black Lives Matter protesters are probably not exactly thrilled with modern day capitalism either. So I think that plays an important part in understanding how this double standard occurs, or what explains the double standard. It's basically, looking at people in two different groups and coming down very harshly on one and not so harshly on the other. And then from there, basically, I just sort of look at this in historical context. I sort of go back in history. It's only an article. It's not a book. So I don't look at that many periods of time. But one period of time I focus on is World War I, the U.S. entry into World War I, which we'll talk about a little bit more next class. But what you saw back then is, again, the government coming down extremely harshly on socialists and anarchists, people who were mostly white, by the way, although you did have Black socialists back then as well. But people who were mostly white, but again, people who were explicitly and overtly anti-capitalist, and in their mind at least, and I would agree with this, very pro-democratic at the same time, wanting to make the country more equal, more democratic for ordinary people, not just for a group of elites. The government came down extremely harshly upon these people, arresting them, deporting them, beating them, killing them. One of the legacies of this period of time is the Espionage Act, which was passed in 1917, which is a law that's still on the books now and has been used to charge people like Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, and Chelsea Manning, who was actually convicted under that act and served jail time, as well as other people. So that's a very important legacy of that. Prior to World War II, you saw groups like the American Legion, which is a veterans group, which is still around today, openly glorify fascism. I have a quote from one of their leaders back then that speaks to that. Groups like this, along with the KKK, who were very active during this period of time. Arguably, this period of time, early 20th century, was actually their real peak of power, not after the Civil War. Were allowed to basically wreak havoc and pretty much get away, literally get away with murder, as they would, whether it was lynching Black people in the South or union organizers, or sometimes both. Lots of times the Black people being killed in the South were Black people trying to organize laborers and trying to organize unions down there as well. And there's also, I provide a citation from a presidential commission on violence, which was convened after the assassination of Martin Luther King and after a lot of the urban uprisings that you saw in the late 1960s. Lyndon Johnson called a special commission on violence, which wanted to research violence in America. And there are many different panels to it that focused on different things. But one of the panels was tasked with looking at labor conflicts within the United States. And they concluded that the United States had the most violent labor struggles of any industrialized country in the world, more than England, more than France, more than any other country. That the violence between employers and employees, between capitalists and workers, or capitalist proletariats, as Karl Marx would say, were the most intense in the United States. And I think that's something to keep in mind as well. And again, I think that this relates a lot to what Wolin is talking about, because you see the double standard, the people that would be most supportive of inverted totalitarianism, of elite control, of consolidating power, of consolidating economic power, tend to be the people who the government, even when they act out, even when they do blatantly illegal things, the government tends to deal with those people very gently, relatively speaking. Whereas people who are sort of most opposed to inverted totalitarianism, people who have the strongest, most radical ideas of democracy, the government tends to come down harshest upon them. So that's how I would kind of connect this with what Wolin is talking about. And again, this is the first class, the first real class, essentially. And I think this will be sort of the way we approach this class. I mean, this will be the way in which we sort of interpret and understand other political events and other aspects of the American political system. That's why I think it's a good sort of starting point, because it gives us a way to explain American politics. And I mean, people can argue against it, certainly. I mean, I'd be curious to hear what people's feedback and reaction is to things like this. And so I guess I'll end it here. And so we'll pick up with the next class. Okay. All right. So take care.